Support for Amplified Voices comes from the Restorative Action Foundation. Learn more at restorativeactionalliance.org.
Everyone has a voice, a story to tell. Some are marginalized and muted. What if there were a way to amplify those stories? To have conversations with real people in real communities? A way to help them step into the power of their lived experience. Welcome to Amplified Voices, a podcast lifting the experiences of people and families impacted by the criminal legal system. Together, we can create positive change for everyone.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Amplified Voices. I'm your host, Jason, with my co-host, Amber. Good afternoon, Amber.
Good afternoon, Jason.
Our guest today is a gentleman by the name of Adnan Kahn, and we're really excited to have him here. Good afternoon, Adnan.
Good afternoon to you too, Jason, Amber. Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you. So before we jump into some of our questions, I'd like to give you an opportunity to tell us a little bit about your past and your childhood and what got you involved in the criminal legal system.
There's a lot to share there. Where do you start in anyone's life in general, right? I think what I'll do is just kind of share pieces of how I grew up, and please feel free to ask whatever you want to. I'm a child of immigrants, but my parents divorced when I was 8 years old. And once they divorced, my father was in the city of San Francisco and he lived in the Tenderloin district. And my mom lived in the suburbs of a place in Richmond, California. And so I was back and forth between mom and dad, but my father was also an absent father.
What's the distance between those?
Maybe an hour drive.
Okay.
So not too much, but his absence created the further distance. It was hard to locate him and find out where he was. And I always say, like, during my incarceration particularly, I wonder how my life would have been if my dad was all the way in my life, or how my life would have been if he was all the way out of my life. But because he was in and out, I think it created more of a tease for me to seek and need a sense of belonging and possibly a positive male role model. So I feel like that always became enhanced for me, that need. By the age of 12, my mother remarried and my stepfather was abusive. I had stepbrothers who were older than me. I was 12 years old in about sixth grade, and they were in high school, juniors, seniors, and they would pick on me, try to beat me up, and I would fight back all the time. My stepfather tried to threaten to kill me, throw me over the bridge. He tried to poison my eye before, all sorts of things. He was sedating my mom, making her take medication so he could continue this type of abuse. Stealing things from me. He would steal things from my mom and put it in my jacket and coat pocket and say that I was stealing from her. Basically, he criminalized me inside the home because he didn't want me around. At 12 years old, I just really pushed back hard on him, and it wasn't a safe environment for me. So then I was moved around to my uncle's house. My mom is eldest of 8 children. Uncle house, grandmother's house, aunt's house. I mean, just back and forth. Everywhere I went, I just never felt like I had a place to belong.
What was school life like for you?
Being in class, it was very difficult to pay attention. I feel like I was a good student. I could learn if I wanted to or when I wanted to, but I felt like I was carrying so much stress and burden. I just couldn't focus in academics. And so by the time I was a teenager, 13 years old, the way I would cope with all the trauma that I was experiencing was through drinking and smoking, particularly smoking weed. And because of that, that became a priority. And so I would cut school. I would run away from home often. I squeezed through my freshman year, sophomore year, and parts of my junior year through night school or summer school. But after 11th grade, I dropped out of high school.
I know that your faith is really important to you. Did that come later?
I think my faith and my spirituality definitely came later. It was, I guess, instilled in me in a home setting. Like I said, I grew up with an immigrant family, and inside the house, it's like I live two worlds. I come inside the house and it's very cultural. But the feud for me was that once I step out of the house, I live in a completely different, impoverished neighborhood with different friends, and policing was different.
Did your parents speak English?
My parents spoke English, yes.
Okay. What's your origin?
My family's from Pakistan.
Did you face discrimination because of that?
Often. My neighbor, when I was in the second grade, right before my parents actually divorced, my neighbor, he was in the third grade. And when the Iraq War, when Desert Storm was happening, I remember going to his door and wanted to play, and he opens the door and he says, "Whose side are you on?" This is a third grader. Whose side are you on? Saddam's or ours?
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, I just didn't understand that at that time. And I'm like, your side. Like, I just didn't get the question. I thought he was joking. But his stepmother, who was behind him or heard him, reprimanded him. Like, why'd you say that?
Right.
And I'm not sure, looking back now where he got those teachings from, but when she reprimanded him, I was like, okay, something was wrong. So I went back and told my mom, my dad, and they were frustrated. And that was one of the earlier experiences. September 11th happened, obviously, when I was like in 11th grade. That was a big shift in Islamophobia as well.
Yeah, definitely. We saw that. So then what happens next?
So my mom ended up divorcing my stepfather. Around the age of 14, my dad completely disappeared away from our life. I have two sisters as well. I'm in the middle. I have a sister a year younger, a sister that's 2 years older. So wherever we were, the three of us were always together, whether we were at our stepfather's, mom's house, grandma's house, uncle's house, wherever we were always together. But we moved with our actual father. By age of 14, he said that, hey, can you live with your mother for a little bit? And then you can come back, move in with me. And that was the last time we heard from him. I haven't heard from him since to this day. Then by the age of 17, my mother remarried and moved out of state. And once she moved out of state, a month later, at the age of 17, my uncle kicked me out of the house. So I lived homeless for about a year. I slept in cars, parks, friends' houses, couches, literally like wherever I could. I turned 18 homeless. I remember that birthday still. Sad birthday, smoking and drinking, trying to forget about not just my physical conditions, but my emotional and mental conditions. And my need at that time was I just needed help. I needed shelter, literally. I just needed somebody who would care for me genuinely. And I just felt like I couldn't find that. The place where I did find that was this gentleman who I'm not going to name, but he was 22 years old at the time. He said that you can come live with me. He found out about my situation. And so I lived with him for maybe a month, not even that. And one night, with him and his friend, and we're smoking weed. And both of them said that, hey, there's a guy we know. He's a good kid from the suburbs, which lives about an hour away. He has $1,000 worth of weed. And since we know him and you don't know him, we'll act like you're buying it from him. Once he hands it to you, run into a car and we'll call up a driver and he'll just drive off and we'll split the goods. So immediately and impulsively, I agreed to it. The agreement was no guns, knives, or weapons were to be used. And for me to, again, like I said, once he handed it to me, run into a car and the driver would drive off. So my friends who set it up called up a driver.
This is like something out of a movie. Was this a first offense for you?
I used to get kicked out of school or expelled and suspended, things like that. As far as police, I did community service. I did a scare straight program at San Quentin when I was like 15 for stealing alcohol at a Safeway. But I've never been to juvenile hall, never put in a cell until after committing this offense.
Okay. So you're like, you want to get high, you're going to do this, you know this person. It's just like a plan to go rob the guy.
Yes, it was a robbery. I don't want to minimize any of my actions. But initially it was like, give it to me, I'm going to run away. We didn't have a car. And so my friend that set this up, he called up his friend that he knew since high school, apparently, a person I maybe met like in passing once before. So this gentleman comes down with the car. The other gentleman who had the $1,000 worth of weed came down. And it was a Monday night around 8 p.m. And once he handed me the weed, it looked like the getaway driver pulled this young man out of the car. And it appeared to me as if they were fighting. So I'm looking out of the window and I just can't understand, why are they fighting? So I get out of the car. I start yelling. At that time, my co-defendant, I was like, what are you doing? I have this stuff, get back in the car. So he gets back in the car as they were fighting in the middle of the road. We leave the scene. And the next morning at 2 a.m., I was arrested. Taken to the forensics, and they took my clothes and did the DNA. And I just didn't really understand the gravity of the offense that I had caused. I honestly thought that I was going to do a few months in jail because, oh my gosh, they got the weed. It was right there in the car, and that's where they found it. So when they finally took me into the interrogation room, that's when the detective told me that you're being charged with robbery and murder. And as soon as I heard that, I just couldn't believe it. I broke down and cried. It didn't make sense to me. I couldn't believe someone had lost their life just a few hours ago. I had taken part in that, at least in the snatch and grab / robbery.
How old were you at this point?
I was 18.
You were 18. You were essentially homeless, living with a friend.
In and out, yes.
And you go through this and you're thinking, I did something, but you had no idea that evening that the person had been murdered?
No, I found out once the detective in that interrogation room told me. It just didn't click. Like, it doesn't make sense. What do you mean, like murder? How did that even happen? No guns, knives, weapons. It just didn't make sense to me. Again, I don't want to go too into detail. I don't want to re-victimize or offend anybody listening that has been harmed by violence. So me skipping over details is not me not being accountable. I just don't want to harm anyone just by listening to some of the stuff that's detailed in the story.
Completely understand. Yes.
And thank you for that too.
Yeah, you're welcome. Going into the interrogation room, that's when I learned a young man who was 19 years old at that time lost his life. So immediately I was responsible and accountable for what I did. And it wasn't to get less time. I just didn't understand the concept of time. I didn't know about this thing called the felony murder rule. I just took responsibility and admitted to what I did because I knew in that moment that this is wrong. And I just can't believe it was traumatic just to hear that for me.
If you wouldn't mind, for those people who don't understand what a felony murder rule is, could you detail what that means?
Yeah, so soon when I was charged with robbery and murder, it didn't also connect that how am I being charged with robbery and a murder? Not saying that I'm not accountable for what I did. I just didn't understand like how that connection was being made for me. So when I finally got to see my attorney, I learned about in California what's called the felony murder rule, which is that if you were involved in a felony, in my case, which was a robbery, then everyone involved is equally guilty of the murder. The law says even if you went as far as to try to stop somebody from hurting someone or killing someone, you're still responsible because the law, all it comes down to is, did you have an intent to commit a robbery? For example, so 4 years later, 3 years actually into my county jail time, when I went to trial, so for example, if you were part of the 12 jurors, your job was not to find me guilty of a murder. So my trial literally started with the district attorney saying that, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we are not here to prove that Mr. Kahn is guilty of a murder. As a matter of fact, I will tell you right now, he is not guilty of the murder, but that's not what your jury instructions are. All you have to do is prove him guilty of an intent to commit a robbery, which I was and still am guilty of. And I admitted to. Yes, I did. My intention were to commit that snatch and grab, but it was a robbery. I took something with force or fear from someone. That's the legal definition. And so the jury obviously found me guilty of an intent to commit a robbery. After that, they went home to their families. The next phase was the judge's phase. And according to the felony murder rule, the judge had to and did sentence me to 25 years to life.
This is so important, but I want to hold that for 1 second. I want to go back to you've been arrested and you're being told what's going on. At that point in your life, who did you even have to call? I mean, what's going through your mind? Are you calling your mother? You don't know where your father is?
No, I haven't spoken to my mother at that time. By then, a year. I didn't even call my sisters. Actually, when I was in the holding tank of my arrest in the county jail, I called the person I was living with sporadically, the one that set up the robbery. That's the only person that I called, and he wasn't picking up the phone. And I found out later that he had made the statement and lied, and the other two gentlemen were never involved or charged in the crime, which is fine. I'm not complaining about that.
But you're the only one who was held accountable for this.
Myself and my co-defendant. So I wanted to share that the young man who committed the murder, he was 21 years old, bipolar schizophrenic, had severe mental health conditions. And there's evidence showing that he was not taking, he had like a list of 8 to 10 different pills that he took for his bipolar, for his schizophrenia, that he ran out of. Him being 21 years old, he had to go renew his prescription into the clinic, which he never did for about 8 days prior to this incident. And because of his paranoia, apparently he had a concealed knife on him. And seeing what happened, like I feel like he was in the sense of reality when he committed this harm against this young man. The things just didn't add up. So that's another tragedy, I think, that yes, a young man lost his life, but how we treat mental health or neglect mental health in this country was a direct result in a tragedy that took place.
So it seems kind of like a perfect storm, if you will, of a lot of things at that point in your life. Obviously, it's something that normally somebody wouldn't say to themselves, okay, well, I'm just going to go commit a robbery or whatnot. But again, at that point, trying to find that sense of belonging, and with all that you had going on, self-medicating. I mean, I can't even imagine being in that situation and how one would cope with your mother moving away, everything that you'd been through, the instability. Am I hearing that right?
Absolutely. Just connecting the dots and reflecting on my life during my incarceration. I always say this, I went from an 8-year-old Little League baseball player to an 18-year-old with a life sentence. Right? And I think it was Jesse Jackson who said, none of us are born armed and dangerous. So what is it that happened in my life that led me down this trajectory of pain and suffering where I wanted to inflict that on someone else? So yes, when my father abandoned me, the need to feel connected, the need for loyalty, my stepfather abusing me not trusting adults, but still wanted a sense of safety, emotional security. And then my being tossed around from my grandparents, uncle, aunts, places and homes. I just felt like my primary caregivers never cared about me. So needing care, needing someone to understand me, yes, a place of belonging. I had a consistency of experiences of instability. Then when my mother finally left and then I was kicked into the streets, it wasn't, like I said, the physical conditions that made me feel alone and abandoned, but it was the emotional conditioning that came with the idea that, yes, I don't care, I don't matter to people. And that was just reinforced throughout my entire life. So that moment and those moments of me being homeless and sleeping in the tennis court or sleeping on a park bench, literally as a 17, 18-year-old, it was very embarrassing and very hurtful. And so I lived in pain. I didn't want to feel that pain anymore. And so I smoked weed and I drank, and that is how I coped and made me feel so much better. But when I ran out of that thing that made me feel better, I wanted to go get it. But what I really, really needed was emotional support. I needed trauma therapy. I needed consistency of care in my community. I mean, there was nowhere for me to go to get that. I couldn't get on a bus for the bus dropped me off of a trauma care center. That didn't exist. There was nowhere I can find that. And so my self-medication was my self-trauma care, which was find more weed to an extent where I'm going to take it from somebody because my pain is worth more than you having this possession of this weed. And all that added up. Going back to just when I was 18 or even 17, by the time I was 17, I was a parentless, homeless, high school dropout. It didn't need for a tragedy to happen, some young kid to lose his life, me to go to prison for a life sentence, for me to get the therapy and the things that I needed to be a successful human being or a healed human being. And sadly, that's what happens in our society. That's what it takes. Sadly, is a tragedy for someone to wake up and finally change something.
So the system failed you. So now several lives were upended. One was eliminated completely. Others were pretty much turned upside down. And you find yourself entering into prison as an 18-year-old, right? Was it that quick?
No, I spent almost 4 years in county jail. It was a 23-hour, 15-minute lockdown. No TV, radio in your cell, just you, your cellie, and books. You have 45 minutes to come outside to work out, take a shower, get on the phone, get a haircut, go to this bookshelf, probably 20 books where the hair clippers are, in a module in a jail. I spent 4 years doing that. 3 years into my trial, and then I waited almost another year to try to appeal my case to the judge, and then finally was sentenced. And then around the age of 22, I was sent to state prison.
The 22, now you end up in prison and you walk in and you've had a little experience in the jail before you go to prison. What's that like when you walk in there for the first time when you're 22?
So, Jason, I just wanted to ask real quick before you answer that part. Adnan, can you explain to people, because a lot of people who are not familiar with criminal justice don't even really understand the difference between jail and prison. And a lot of times in jail, there just aren't the same type of services and supports. So to have spent 4 years in a jail is pretty significant.
So the difference of jail was that jail is a place where people are not guilty yet for the most part, especially where I was housed. I was housed in a more maximum jail to where certain types of crimes, that's where you would be if you're fighting your case. So basically for almost 4 years, or at least 3 years for sure, I was going back and forth to the judge, to the courtroom, and then being put back into a jail cell. I wasn't sentenced. I was not found guilty yet. There were other people that were in this jail housing unit with me that were just like me, that were going to see the judge, that were fighting their case back and forth, seeing their attorney, that were not found guilty yet. Now, those who are found guilty and sentenced, if you have less than, at that time, 8 months or less, you could serve your time in the county jail, which is in the county that you committed your crime, which is very local. But if it was anything more than that, you would get sent somewhere across the state of California into a state prison. Now, I've heard in the past where jail is like high school and prison is like college. Not education-wise, but maturity-wise, I guess you could say. Danger-wise, I guess you could say. I hope I'm describing that properly. I don't know if that was right description.
There's no right or wrong answer. It's just in the interest of people learning and understanding kind of the experience. I just thought it was important to make the designation between the two, because a lot of people really use those terms interchangeably because they just don't know it's different.
Yeah, huge difference between jail and prison. Really, really big difference. Prison's a lot more, it has a more permanent feel. Jail has more of a temporary feel. because there's a big question mark on your sentence or your time. Or for 3 years, I had no idea what I would be sentenced to. Almost 4 years, actually. I had no idea, like, am I going to spend my life in here? Am I going to 10 months or am I going to get acquitted? I just don't know. So even though I spent 4 years before trial, before I got sent to a state prison, there was still this idea of it being temporary. But once I finally went to prison with the life sentence, like, this is it. I'm going to live and die right here.
Okay, so then let's go into Jason's question, which was, okay, so now you're sent to the prison. Tell us a little bit about that.
So I get sent to the prison. I eventually ended up in Corcoran, which is in rural Central California. I think the closest city is Fresno, which is about an hour away from this prison. And I get there, it's a level 4, what we call here in California, maximum security prison, where you're sentenced there. If you're a lifer serving a life sentence, you start off in a maximum security prison. Before I got there, I just want to really quickly talk about how I got there specifically, because at that time, at least, there was this risk assessment that the administration, the state prison officials did and still do. And this is what the risk assessment was. So there's a point system. The higher points I have, the higher security level I would go to. So because I had 25 to life, they gave me double points. They gave me like extra points. So really quick, just want to say that the number to reach a level 4 maximum security at that time was like 63 or 4 or 5, something like that. So whatever the points were, I needed to go lower than 64 or 65 points, not to go to a maximum security prison. However, because I had 25 to life, they doubled that, which gave me 50 points. I got extra points for being 18 at the time of my crime. I got extra points for not being married or having children. Because I wasn't in the military, I had more points. Because I didn't have a high school diploma or a GED, even though I had a GED or high school diploma at the time of this interview, I spent 4 years in county jail and I ended up getting my GED there. So they gave me more points because I didn't get arrested with the degree. So all those things, according to the correction system, said that I was a threat, not to society, I'm already in prison, but is a threat to other people, and I belong in a maximum security prison. So here I am, 22 years old. That's the reason why I'm sent to this maximum security prison. I remember like they handed me my linen. I finally get put into a cell. This is my first time ever in a maximum security prison cell. They put me in there, and there was this 6'3", 300 plus pound Samoan gang member from LA. He was like a Crip from LA. And he says, "Hey man, we're on lockdown." I'm like, "What do you mean we're on lockdown?" He said, "Well, we're on lockdown because there was a man who was killed in the chapel." Now, that's how my first 2 minutes being sentenced to life in a maximum security prison started.
Welcome to your new home.
Welcome to your new home. And the point was like, if someone's getting killed in church services, there's no safe place in this facility. And I have to spend the rest of my life, whatever that number is, here. So my priority, yes, I would read, pick up books, and yes, I would like try to grow and educate myself. My priority immediately, and it always was during my incarceration, it was survival, whatever that meant. So survival took precedent over everything.
You know, what's interesting is I read one of your blog entries that talked about how you lost a friend recently who had COVID, who is still in prison. And in there, you also talked about how some of the relationships that you developed were pretty meaningful, deeper relationships that you might form with somebody who hasn't lived through that same experience. And I was discussing that with Amber earlier. She read the same thing, was touched by it. And the question that struck me was, we've heard so many things about people being protective and not really opening up to other people when they're inside of prison. But it sounds like your experience was a little bit different there, where you had some people you could really trust and you became really close to. Is that accurate?
Yeah, it's accurate depending on who, when, and where. So if I was in the maximum security prison, it was much more toxicity, and specifically like toxic masculinity was very relevant and prevalent there. So it's not like I'm going to go and talk to everybody on the prison yard about my childhood and my abuse and trauma. It wasn't really until you learn in depth about people, whether either spending time with them in a cell or 12 years later when I got to a place like San Quentin, which was a lower level prison, which offered, well, the prison didn't necessarily offer the prisons. It was a lot of the community-based organizers that were coming into this facility that were creating this space for us to talk about our trauma and get some type of healing. That's where I learned more and more about people. When you're in a maximum security prison with that type of environment, it's not so much about maximum security prison. It's about a safe space to talk about people who were molested, people who were kidnapped, people who were, literally, I learned that about my friends, people who were abused and beaten with closed fists. I talked about that in the article. I sit there and I learn about this person's childhood, and they learn about mine, and that level of intimacy that we receive from each other. And we become each other's like confidants and like become each other's safety nets, I guess you could say. So I did learn that about people. There are people who I know in there I spent 3 years in a cell with, and I know this person very, very well. I know their whole childhood. I know the goodness in their heart, the amends that they're making, the genuine remorse that they have for what they've done. But most of society doesn't see that. So it is that proximity that allows me and allows people to really get to know who people are as a whole and beyond the commitment offense that they've done.
So I think it's really interesting kind of what you just said, because when we think about prison, incarceration, and, what I refer to as state harm, because we're really meeting violence with additional violence and caging human beings, they're really relying a lot on community organizations to come in and provide services to people that are being harmed by the system. So I think it's really interesting that the safe space that you found was created by outside organizations.
It was supported, I want to say, by outside organizations. 90% of the programs or more, at least in San Quentin, were created by incarcerated people. It was just Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous that was consistently just provided as if that's going to heal everyone's trauma. And not to discredit anything those programs have. I think they have pretty amazing programs, but for some people, it's different things for different people. There was a group when I got to San Quentin that was called Kid Cat. It's kids creating awareness together. And basically the group was created by a bunch of people who were sentenced to life as teenagers. So here's a bunch of guys who were in their mid-30s, 40s, possibly 50s, were on the tiers or in the buildings or on the prison yard and realizing like we've been locked up since literally 14, 15, 16 years old. Like me, for example, I learned how to shave in prison. An elderly gentleman taught me how to shave. I didn't know how to shave. My father wasn't around. I didn't have facial hair like that until I was like 18, 19, 20 years old.
This is a podcast, people can't see it. It seems like you forgot,
Yeah, I think so.
It's COVID, guys.
It's COVID.
So I get this subscription to Harry's Razors. It's really cool. They send you new blades all the time.
Send it over. I will love to use that and send that inside as well. But I learned also that someone coming in at 14, 15, like people had never had a driver's license, never had a bank account, never had a debit card, never been to a prom before. These are like the people who are incarcerated. And then you compound that with the traumas and abuse that they've experienced and suffered. So this group that I'm using as examples is because there was a group was created by a bunch of those guys who are like, hey, we need to understand our childhood development because we were raised, matured physically, physiologically, and emotionally like in prison. So like as a 16, 17, 18, 19-year-old now, 20 years in, what does that development look like? It's different from AA and NA in my opinion. So basically a lot of the programs, 90+% were created by incarcerated people and were supported by outside organizations.
Oh, that's great. And you made a comment before about how most of society doesn't see that. And you were referring to people and really their humanity. And I think that one of the things that you're describing is that people are much more than, and we've said it before, the worst thing that they've ever done. And when you look at it, you find that a lot of people who have caused harm have actually had a lot of trauma in their lives that led up to that harm. You're no exception. And so it's amazing how you've been exposed to all of that and you've been able to see these people and see the good in a lot of people who you interacted with.
Yeah, I mean, you get a chance to kind of know the person in their totality as a whole. And I think that once we take people, to use that term, lock them up in terms of locking up their personality or locking up, their potential, we never get to see who people really are. I can't tell you that how many of us committing a crime or not, how many of us are the same people we were before the pandemic, which is just 6 months ago? How many of us same person that we were 5 years ago or 10 years ago? How many of us are the same people we were at 18 years old? It's just different. There's this journey, there's maturity, there's experiences, different thoughts, different moments that can change the trajectory of someone's life. I don't even like using the word change. I want to mention that too. When people ask me this question, when did you change? It's a very tough question. I think it comes with the bias itself that once you were bad, something happened and now you're good. And I have to kind of convince people of, yes, I was bad. This happened in my life. And now let me prove to you that I'm good and I'm worthy. But really what it is, I like to say that I didn't change. I've evolved. I matured. I'm still like everything that I was. Even with rehabilitation, I remember after I got out last year, I was asked to testify in front of a Senate hearing committee here in California at the Capitol. And one of the senators asked me, wow, great to see you here. It's amazing. Can you tell us why you changed and how rehabilitation worked for you? And my response was like, I was not frustrated, but my response was that rehabilitation is not taking a class and beating or killing the monster that's inside of me. Rehabilitation is actually being reminded of and uplifting the qualities that I've always had, which is care, empathy, love, humor. Those are all the things I've always had. And it was the trauma that allowed me to, and permitted and actually subjugated all of that for me. Even though that exists, it's not like that it was just completely gone. That existed all the time. And it was in prison that allowed me to bring that back. It wasn't taking a class particularly that allowed me to bring that back like it was gone. It was always there. It's just that those were the qualities and characteristics of me as a human being that were seen by community, by my peers, and still seen by some parts of society, not all.
So you spent, what, 16 or 17 years in prison?
16.
16 years. And that's in addition to the 4 years?
Collectively 16.
Collectively 16 years. And so if you had to rewrite for somebody else who's identical to you, was in the same situation, ended up committing a crime, how would you rewrite the script so that the experience was completely different?
You know, that is one of the hardest questions to ask, because I don't want anyone else to harm anybody or commit a crime ever. So to rewrite that person's life without rewriting society around that individual would be a huge miss for me if I were to do that. It's not that I can rewrite a person that's completely identical to my story at 18 years old. I have to rewrite everything around them, not just that person's decision. And then I have to rewrite that person's childhood, which means sets of experiences and help and comfort and care and services provided. So it's not a capsule or moment in time that I would rewrite. It would have to be the entire thing and the societal structures as well.
That's a beautiful answer.
So I think that's a really good point that you're making, because a lot of people have this idea, like you referred to, that if somebody commits some sort of act of violence or harms someone else, they just are a bad person. And so what we really need to be looking at is the act and what conditions were around a person that led them to that act. So we kind of talk about that all the time. And so looking at systems and society and culture and all of those things that contribute to the conditions that have these types of things happening is obviously a much better approach to get to the root of the problems, but not easy because it's very complex.
It's very complex. And, people think that once you get sent to prison, that you're going to be punished and harmed, which is absolutely true. What I've also learned is that the system is not created for accountability. There's no space for making amends to the harm that you've done directly to the person you've harmed, or making amends indirectly. There's no space for that. To hold someone accountable isn't like, go here and we're going to hurt you. That's not accountability. What I've also learned is a lot of people come from so much violence and suffered so much violence and have committed violence to where when you get sent to a prison, it's just a perpetuation of your life already. And it's inhumane.
It's just more violence.
It's more violence. And what I found also was, for me, it is much, much easier, or it has been much, much easier to punch a person in the face versus address my trauma. People always want to use worst of the worst. They want to use people with tattoos on their faces and this dangerous gang member. It is much easier, in my experience, for I've seen gang members to stab somebody in prison versus talking about in a trauma healing way to say that, I was molested at 12 and that's why I joined a gang. It is much easier to stab someone than to say I was molested at 12. That's what society fails to realize, is what safety truly means. Look at them, they're criminals, they're hurting people, they're in there rioting, they're in there stabbing each other. There's reasons for that.
Right.
And people don't never look at that and never look at what true healing truly means. You want people to stop doing what they're doing. You don't enable violence, because if that's what created violence in the first place, enabling it is counterintuitive and counterproductive. So the state violence that you're talking about, Amber, is exactly on point. There's violence upon violence, but they talk about public safety, and the math doesn't add up.
I'd like to go back to your faith for a minute. So we talked earlier about your faith was important to you, and then you're in prison, and when you got in there was something that happened in the chapel. So were you able to practice your faith? Did you find that there was any discrimination while you were in prison? So everything that's involved with that.
There's always a struggle to practice your faith in prison. Specifically, let's talk about religion. And there's always a doubt when it comes to administration. Sure, they have services there. Sure, they have space for Muslims to pray, possibly if there isn't lockdown and things like that, or people who have a Christianity background, or even Jewish, they're interchangeable places where people can go and experience that or find religious space for them. But the truth is that administratively, a lot of times they're like, oh, you're faking it. you're still in the prison. You're not a changed person. So it's not necessarily taken too seriously to provide that space for you. They also don't understand a journey a person takes. Just because I pick up a Bible or Quran doesn't mean I'm like immediately pure. As soon as I touched it, there it is. All my impurities are gone. It's the journey that people go through that don't necessarily get the space or the time that they need to experience that journey or the help that's on top of that. For me, I took it upon myself to educate myself, to read books, to learn definitions. Like I said, I came in as a high school dropout to really sit and reflect on my life, on my spirituality, on my morals, on my characteristics, on everything. It was just me and finding people around me that can support that, which wasn't always found.
You did a lot of reading, not just about the faith. I could tell you did a lot of reading while you were in prison. Am I right?
Yeah, I mean, one of my favorite things to read were biographies or autobiographies about successful people or famous people.
So what's your favorite book?
I can't say, man. And people ask me that question all the time. And I just don't have one. I mean, like reading Steve Jobs even. I think one of my favorite ones is Einstein's biography. And it's not because of the obvious, oh, he was Einstein or he was a genius.
Was that the one by Walter Isaacson?
Walter Isaacson, absolutely.
That's a great book.
He actually wrote both of those books that I'm talking about, Steve Jobs, and he did one great one on Benjamin Franklin as well.
Yeah, I read that one too.
But the one about Einstein, for me, when Einstein was so into his imagination and creativity, and one of his quotes were, and I'm going to paraphrase this, one of his quotes were that imagination is more important than knowledge. Because he would literally imagine himself next to, like, when thinking of the speed of light, of sitting on a rocket or whatever he was sitting on and going next to the speed of light. But it was his imagination that allowed him to kind of like think beyond the confines of what he was taught and where he was at. And so for me, that meant prison, that meant my cell, and meant a box. For a long time, I was on the top bunk of a cell. And I remember literally measuring the ceiling from my face was 3 feet away. And so it felt like a coffin, and it felt everything was closing in, but my imagination was my escape. The journey of people and how people were thinking and what they went through before their fame or before their success is what always captivated. One more thing that I really, really enjoyed reading, it's more than enjoyed, the first book that was handed to me about a day or two in jail at 18 years old was Blood in My Eye by George Jackson, who was a revolutionary in the 70s. He was killed in San Quentin. There's a whole history there. Matter of fact, yesterday was a memorable day for that time. Angela Davis. I mean, that was the first book I read, Blood in My Eye. I could barely read it. It was complicated. It was dense, but I read it. Someone handed it to me and it was there and I read it. And then I read Soledad Brothers and Hurricane Carter. And then, the counterintelligence program about the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover. I mean, those are like the first 5 or 6 books that I read in county jail. But what that ended up doing was sparking, well, first what it did for me was it made me want to investigate my conditions. Very early on, it came to a time in my life where I wanted to investigate my conditions, not just my emotional and my mental health conditions, but particularly like my physical conditions, jail, prison, the system. Why is this like this? Which took me down the path of Foucault. And, I'm probably going to bore you with all this stuff. I could become a little nerd sometime when it comes to this. But really understanding psychology and philosophy of incarceration and state violence, like you were saying, Amber.
I'm listening to you and I'm just like, GED when you were in jail, and to listen to you speak, it's like you got a PhD in criminal justice. It's amazing where you are today.
I know the listeners can't see you, but I just like to say, like, just watching you, how passionate you are and how excited you are about the topic and the knowledge that you gain is so inspiring. And I can only imagine how infectious it is when people are interacting with you. So let's talk a little bit about what you're doing now.
Where he is now, there's a step there that we have to touch on, Amber, and that's, so you thought you had a life sentence,
right,
for the majority of time.
No, I knew I did.
Well, you knew you had a life sentence for the majority of time that you were incarcerated. What happened? How did that change? And then answer Amber's question.
Jason keeps me honest.
All right, so I knew because of the felony murder rule that I would have to do at least 25 years before I even appear before a parole board, which is a possible opportunity to go home. And even though I appealed my case, even during my appeals, it was like, let me just try it. I knew that it would not be an appeal that would get me out, because in an appeal, the court has to make an error. And the court didn't make an error. According to the law, they did everything right. I was sentenced to life, because of the felony murder rule, because it said that if you're guilty of an intent to commit a robbery equals 25 to life. I always knew at the age of 18, when I learned about the felony murder rule, the felony murder rule had to be amended, abolished somehow, some way, if I have a shot at going home before that. So I knew that and even tried to research it. And one of the first stories that I heard about while I was still in county jail before I even was convicted was Brandon Hines' case. And this gentleman was felony murder. And I didn't know who he was, but that was the first time I heard someone advocating about that this law is wrong. And I was like, wow, someone believes that this law is not right. Does not negate accountability for me. But I just knew that 25 to life and how just things went, that was my only way out. Fast forward way down the line, about 12, 13 years later, when I got to San Quentin and that group that I was telling you about earlier. So there was an organization coming in when I was in San Quentin from Human Rights Watch. And there was this woman named Alex Malik. So Alex was working at Human Rights Watch, and Alex would come into the prison in this particular class in this program. And what we were doing was there were a lot of laws and legislation that was changing around people who were sentenced to life as teenagers. And not to bore you with numbers and Senate bills, but just to name it, it was Senate Bill 260, 261, and these little things were slowly changing over the course. And so one day, Alex asked me, like, how long do you have before you go home? And I said, hey, I have about 12 or 13 more years before I appear before a parole board. And the only way for me to go home is if we change the felony murder rule. And she just says, all right, let's try, let's do it. And I'm like, yeah, let's do it. So we ended up creating a space in San Quentin where there's a media center where they have the San Quentin newspaper, Ear Hustle. And I created this project with Alex called First Watch, which is a video project. Imagine incarcerated people walking around with cameras and filming our own narratives, right? And editing it, and it's on YouTube. So simultaneously, what we were doing, we were trying to start a way to get the felony murder rule amended or passed. So she would come in with information and research, and I would look at it, study it, and then we would strategize. And then that's when we created this organization called Restore Justice, which was a nonprofit. And we wanted to create a space and a structure for us to continue doing this law or trying to change it. And next thing you know, like there was this first phase was a resolution that we had to get through. And I'm reading the resolution that was written by an attorney that we hired. I fundraised from prison, brought in funders, brought in people to have a foundation of Restore Justice, all the way down to color. She came in with like printouts of the website. She's like, look, how do you want this? What color do you want? Like, we don't want orange because that's too prison-y. We don't want green because that's correctional officers. How about teal? Let's just keep it teal because we work with survivors and victims of crime in our work. And so all the way down to the logo. Oh, I like the colon between R and J. And so as we co-founded that, the resolution of the felony murder at that time turned into a bill called Senate Bill 1437, where our senator in Berkeley, Nancy Skinner, picked it up, put her name on it. We continued to do work. I remember there was a part where the senators needed data. They said, how many people are the non-killer under felony murder rule? So when we asked corrections, hey, can you give us data on how many people are the non-killer under felony murder rule? They didn't have that. Because if you came into the system as a killer or non-killer of a crime, you were just in together. And so when we said, hey, can we ask you guys to give us research? They said, oh, no, just a bunch of runaround. So what we ended up doing was, and the brilliance of Alex, we made our own survey. I wrote it with Alex back there in the media center and did the little checkbox on a lined piece of paper about different little questions on the survey. She prints it out. She brings it back. I edit it. And what she ended up doing was handing it to a bunch of advocates and even chaplains and imams and rabbis that go into facilities. And they took a copy. They literally, many of them hid it and brought it in. Let's just say that.
Yes.
And handed it out to one person. And they ended up, making copies. Next thing you know, in our office outside, thousands of research slips were coming back. So we ended up doing our own research. And we found out that this is the most shocking statistics that I learned was 72% of women in California prison for homicide are the non-killer. 72%. Serving a life sentence.
That's astounding.
Astounding. And they didn't have the data. We had to do that ourselves by sneaking in surveys. Then we got the number. And I just want to say that it took a while. And while this is going on, I'm learning the legislative process, right? Okay, it's a resolution. Now it's a Senate bill. It has to get through appropriation. It had to get to public safety, appropriations, Senate floor. Then it goes to the Assembly. So we went through the 3 stages. It took about a year almost, actually 3 years from the beginning of the inception of us kicking off this law, creating an organization and then pushing it, to just every stage of it. We have 40 senators in California, finally gets past the majority Senate floor on the 3rd phase of the Senate. It goes into the assembly, which is now 80 people in the same 3 stages: public safety, appropriations, assembly floor. So in August of 2018, it's at its last stage, the bill, and its final hearing. We need 41 votes out of 80 in the assembly. And I'm still in San Quentin. I'm still locked up. Alex and them are, a bunch of advocates have jumped on board, a bunch of organizations, a bunch of people are now like helping this for a while, like push this through.
Are you the poster boy for this? I mean, do they have pictures of you? And
yes and no. I also wanted to be mindful because you can't be an activist in prison. So while I was actually in San Quentin, I try to hide it as much as possible that we were the ones. I could get sent to the hole, or I don't know, for whatever reason.
Wow.
yeah, it's scary.
Yeah, a lot of people don't know that I was a co-founder of an organization till way later, or that we were doing this. Even though we had a space, we were doing the videos and we were doing other events with survivors and victims, which I haven't spoken about yet. Anyways, the last night that is supposed to get voted on after almost a year, 2 years of hard work, the vote gets to vote number 38 and then gets to like 39. We got 39th vote. We need 2 more. And it's almost like midnight, I think, or late night. And they're going to take it off the voting cycle or whatever. Like, okay, we're kind of done. That's it. And mind you, if we get 40 votes, that tie goes to the assembly, not us. Which means we have to start all the way from the beginning, rewind, go back 2 years, start the bill again and all of that. Then it finally got to 39. They almost took it off. They actually did take it off. They were asked to put the Senate bill back on for votes. Then we got 40. Then, a bunch of little phone calls and texts happened in between, and they almost took it off. And then boom, we got the 41st vote. And that's how the law ended up passing and almost didn't pass. I wasn't even there. And this is the story that Alex was telling me. It passes, we get our 41st vote. Some other assembly member jumped on board way late and got the 42nd vote, which didn't matter. And then it ends up passing. However, so the next morning, someone comes to my cell. I'm brushing my teeth. They're like, hey, man, congratulations, it passed, right? And this person apparently had a cell phone and he was following along and stuff. And though I was excited and I was like, great, it passed, I just knew that there's going to be opposition, even though it passed. I knew there was going to be opposition, so I was not excited. It's not like as if I'm going home. I didn't believe that or feel that immediately. So mind you, this is in August, and the law actually doesn't go into effect until January 2nd, officially, even though it passes. That's like the legal calendar. So I knew that, yes, it passed in August. I still have several months. And during those several months, opposition came hard. District attorneys are saying it's unconstitutional. It couldn't be done this way. Judges are denying it. I mean, all of this nonsense is happening. One night in January, I fell asleep, and I remember falling asleep at around 11 o'clock p.m. I was awakened at 12:40 a.m. by a correctional officer. And in San Quentin, there's 5 floors or tiers. I lived on the 5th tier. 12:40 a.m., correctional officer wakes me up and he says, hey, Kahn, he slides 2 clear trash bags under my cell. And he says, hey, pack your stuff. County jail people are coming to pick you up. And I'm like, no, this is wrong. This is a mistake. There's a clerical error. Can you call your superior, your sergeant, lieutenant, and tell them this is a mistake, that I refuse. I don't want to go to county jail, a place where I spent 4 years. I'm not going back there. It's hell. I'm comfortable here, right, in my cell in San Quentin. I created an organization. I'm just doing well. I don't want to go there for no reason. Why are you taking me there? So the poor guy walks downstairs. 10 minutes later, he comes back and says, hey, man, I called my superior, and they said that it's a different jurisdiction. County jail is coming to pick you up. So it's county jail versus state prison. And they said the different jurisdiction is coming to pick you up. We can't do anything about it. So I'm like, very angry and frustrated. Also, I want to say that when you go out to court, that's what they call it, OTC, out to court, you always come back because you are quote unquote state property. And so even though I was going, I was like, I don't know when I'm going to come back. So I ended up packing most of my stuff, my essentials that I needed, all my writings and everything I've been doing for 16 years at that time, and just left my food and hygiene items and clothes to my cellie because I knew I was going to come back, or assumed I was going to come back. Anyways, next morning, I'm in the bullpen until like 4 a.m. waiting for the van to come get me. The van comes, gets me, they belly chain me, put me in a dark van where I couldn't even see my hand in front of my face, inside of a cage in a van, by the way. And I remember there was this part where we're going over the bridge. I could feel we're going over a bridge. And I remember thinking to myself, if we crash, there is no way they're going to come back here and unlock this door and then unlock this cage that's in this van. Those thoughts were coming to my mind. Finally get to county jail, still angry, frustrated. Why am I here? I'm in a paper jumpsuit. I'm in a bullpen or intake cell, which is crowded with people, shoulder to shoulder, very small, in the toilet. People are sleeping on the floor. Mind you, I've got 16 years incarcerated. There are people who are coming in that are incarcerated for an hour or half an hour, just got locked up. Just that dynamic, like, wow, I remember this. And I don't know what their journey is going to be like in the next several months or years. I haven't slept. I didn't eat. I was in this intake holding cell until midnight. I got there at 9 a.m. in the county jail bullpen or intake cell. 12 midnight, I was put into a cell. 4 a.m., I'm awakened and told you're going to court to be put in another bullpen. So for about 48 hours, I ate a piece of bologna sandwich and a carton of milk and barely slept for about 2 days. I get into the courtroom and my attorney's there. And before I got into the courtroom, apparently my family and my friends and Alex, I told my cellie to call them. Here's the number. I'm going to county jail. Can you tell them they sent me to county jail? So apparently a whole bunch of them came just to show support to the judge. Like, he has family, he has support. I get into the courtroom. It's empty except for my attorney. The bailiff says, sit down. Don't look behind you. Just look straight. Your family or whoever's out there is going to come walking in. You're not allowed to look back. Just keep looking straight and wait for the judge to come in.
Oh my God.
So right before the judge comes in, I turned to my attorney. First thing that I asked her is like, hey, is the victim's family here? I didn't want to re-victimize or harm the family that I haven't seen or they haven't heard from me in years. And whether I had to either say something to the judge or even just seeing my physical body there, I was concerned about re-victimizing them or having the right to say anything. And not a legal right, but just a mental and emotional right. I don't know if I have that or not. So I asked, like, are they here? And she said, no, they're not here. So then my next question was, hey, okay, as soon as this hearing or whatever this is over, can you please send me back to state prison? I don't want to be here. I remember telling her, like, I don't want to be here. I told her the Super Bowl is next week. I just want to watch the Super Bowl in San Quentin. So can you please send me back to San Quentin and tell them to ship me immediately after this hearing? She said, yeah, I got you. I'll take care of all of that. So like, that was my concern, was the Super Bowl, to watch that the following week in my cell in San Quentin. Literally seconds later, in walks the judge. It's the same judge that sentenced me to 25 to life. She walks in and she says, okay, Mr. Kahn, I looked at the new legislation that passed. I've looked at your case. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to re-sentence you for the robbery to 3 years. And since you've done more than 5 times that amount, I'm going to release you today.
Wow.
And I just froze. I could hear cries and gasps behind me. I'm holding back this burst of tears and just, I've said this before, but the term unbelievable, like everything registered. I heard it. I know what she said, but that term never fit more perfectly in my life. Unbelievable than that moment. And yeah, it was like, are you kidding me? Like, you're telling me I'm not serving a life sentence. It was just crazy. Like, I just wanted to go back to San Quentin and watch the Super Bowl. And seconds later, you're telling me you're releasing me now, today. And then my attorney even said, hey, Your Honor, like, you didn't mention anything about parole or probation. Can you stipulate that? Oh, she says, no, he's done 5 times that amount. I'm not putting him on parole or probation. That's excessive. She says, good luck, Mr. Kahn. And she told my family he has a few minutes to process out, or hour or so. You may want to get him some clothes. And about an hour or so later, I'm walking out and going over the Bay Bridge, the bridge that I grew up on in the city I grew up on, in a car with Alex. By the way, which I didn't mention, we had this secret love relationship inside. So it was literally her love. That's my wife now. And that's who I have a child with.
Oh, that.
I can't even, I'm like in tears over here. Like, this is crazy. That is the most beautiful thing I've ever heard in my life.
The human rights attorney.
Well, she was an attorney. She was an advocate in working on the Northern California chapter of Human Rights. And then we both co-founded the organization. It was literally her deep sense of love for me that wanted to change this law. And she, she's brilliant, by the way. And then the law changes and we have this, which is a story come out some other day, but this very difficult love relationship for about 3 years, and difficult in terms of the setting. And we just wanted to pass the law, and,
right.
And it was illegal. Mind you, she's not coming to visit me in a visit room. She's coming into the facility.
Yeah, but she saw something in you, and the two of you were able to do something miraculous. And now you have a child. Congratulations.
Now we have a child. And I just want to say too, there's approximately at least 2,000 people that eventually, once all this stuff is litigated or stipulated, the legality of it, there'll be approximately 2,000 people plus that will benefit from this law.
Wow.
Wow. If that's not inspiring, I just don't even know what is. I really just don't. I'm flabbergasted because I don't think I knew this. Obviously, I didn't.
What an incredible story, Adnan. We're getting close to the end of the hour. I just want to ask you, you mentioned a couple of projects. What would you like to promote? You want to talk about how people can find you on social media, what projects you want people to support. This is your opportunity to really plug all those things.
I don't particularly have a project to support. If there is one, I would want to encourage people. I'm not sure if there could be a link you could set up, but back in March, our organization created a Facebook page called Give Directly, Canteen Support for Incarcerated People during times of COVID particularly. So basically, if you have a family member, you can punch their name, prison number, and their location, and it'll go on like a database. And there are donors and funders who will come on and give money directly to that person's account so they can go to canteen. So basically, if you have a loved one that's inside, you can put their name in this account. And if you're a donor, please check that out and donate to people directly so they can buy hygiene items and they can buy essential food for themselves during these hard times. And that's the only thing I would want to promote. Other than that, check me out on Twitter at AKHAN and 1437. So that's why I have 1437 is the Senate Bill 1437.
Yeah. And if you could email me that link for the donations, we'll get that into the notes.
Yeah, that's a wonderful project and so important in these times of COVID-19 when it's important for people to have soap and all the items that they may not be able to get. And they're so disconnected from family. So that's amazing.
So before we wrap up, is there anything else that we've really missed that you want to make sure you get out there? And
I don't particularly have anything else to add besides a thank you and gratitude for giving me this space. I know for a fact I was rambling today because I had this huge cup of coffee during this interview. And I told myself, don't do that because I ended up just talking really, really fast and getting overexcited. So I apologize for that. But let me know if there's anything else you can.
No apologies necessary.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on and talking with us. Your story is truly incredible. What you've been through, what you were able to accomplish, the fact that you found your life partner and you have a family and you thought you were facing a lifetime being incarcerated and you're out here and you're advocating for others and we see you on Twitter all the time talking about people and really putting human stories to the people that are still facing extended punishment. So thank you for all the work that you do. Thank you for coming on. And it was a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you, Amber. Thank you, Jason, for having me and allowing me to express my story to you.
Until next time, Amber.
We'll see you next time, Jason.
You've been listening to Amplified Voices, a podcast lifting the experiences of people and families impacted by the criminal legal system. For more information, episodes, and podcast notes, visit amplifiedvoices.show.